NLP models are well known to perpetuate bias like racism and sexism. But a lot of times these models are evaluated for bias using synthetic data sets that were constructed for the purpose of probing models and are not necessarily reflective of direct harms. But people are considering deploying NLP models in real high-stakes settings. In this work, we consider one such setting, Child Protective Services. CPS agencies have lots of text data that logs contacts with families. This data often has useful information about family situations, but it can be too numerous to review manually, especially when making time-sensitive decisions. Additionally, reviewing and processing data is part of the administrative burden that can contribute to caseworker turnover and burnout. So this is a scenario where NLP seems like it might be helpful for helping caseworkers process text data more effectively and also more efficiently. However, NLP models are prone to exacerbating bias, and there is documented existing racial bias in CPS settings. Specifically, Black children compared to white children may be more likely to be reported for abuse by doctors. They also, when allegations are reported, are screened in more often for Black children than for white children nationwide. And in the state that we focus on in this work, Black children are placed in foster care at higher rates. The central question that we ask in this work is if the deployment of NLP tools is liable to increase bias against Black families as compared to white families in CPS settings. I'll start by introducing our raw data, and then I'll discuss the two types of NLP models that we investigate in this setting. The data set that we work with is a set of 3.1 million contact notes from a Department of Human Services in one county who asked to remain anonymous in this presentation. The data was shared with our research team under a data sharing agreement and IRB approved protocol, and throughout this work, it was stored on a secure disk encrypted server with access restricted. As our work focuses on racial bias, I'll take a moment to mention how we define race in this setting. We use individual level records of race that are imported by CPS workers. So this does mean that we exclude any data where race was not specified. We also focus specifically on Black and white people because of the history of bias against Black people in CPS settings. While this is a limitation, it does capture most of the data in the county that we're working with. Additionally, when we consider referral or case level metrics, since referrals and cases can involve multiple people, we assume that a referral case is Black associated if at least 50% of the people involved were recorded as being Black, and similarly for white. When we look at the raw data, we do see differences in the content of notes about Black and white families. So specifically, we compute words that were overrepresented in contact notes associated with Black families as compared to white families. Some of these differences likely reflect events or reasons that families were referred to CPS. So notes about Black families tend to refer to basic needs as well as physical abuse, whereas notes about white families tend to refer to substance abuse. We do also see some word differences that may be more reflective of note writing style rather than content. Overall, the fact that we do find differences in language used in these notes suggests that we may also find differences in the performance of models that are trained or deployed over these notes. And we investigate some of those models next. The first model that we investigate is an existing risk assessment tool. To provide a little background, child welfare cases typically begin with a referral where someone, for example, calls a hotline with concerns about a child. Call screening staff then determine whether or not to open an investigation into the referral. If an investigation is opened, one of the events that could happen is through a court order, a child could be removed from their home. The county that we're working with uses a risk assessment tool that provides a predicted risk score to call screening staff. This score is derived from a model that's trained to predict the likelihood of a child being placed out of home conditional on the referral being screened in for investigation. The model is trained using structured data that includes things like past interactions with CPS. In this work, we investigate if incorporating text features increases the model performance disparities for Black and white children. In the paper, we provide more details about how the model is implemented and how exactly we integrate text features, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to jump to the results. The overall performance differences of the model once we integrate text features are pretty small. But one of the direct harms that we investigate is if incorporating text features is liable to increase the number of Black families that are flagged as high risk by the model. When we look at the model without text features, we do see that a higher percentage of Black children are flagged as high risk when compared to white children. But when we integrate text features, we don't find that this disparity increases. We actually find it a little bit decreases. We look at a lot of other metrics in the paper as well, but the higher level summary is that we don't find any evidence that incorporating text features into this specific tool increases the racial disparities in its performance. The next category of tools that we examine are information extraction tools. And we start with named entity recognition. The task of named entity recognition involves identifying spans of text that refer to things by name, and we specifically focus on people. An example of where this type of technology might be used in a CPS setting is in the event that a child is removed from their home, a caseworker could use an NER tool to search through notes about a family to identify people who might be able to be caregivers for the child. We examine 4 different NER models, and we examine first names as well as full names and notes about cases as well as notes about referrals. And across all of these configurations, we find that all models have significantly higher recall in identifying names of white people than Black people. So what this means in our hypothetical use case is that if caseworkers relied on an NER model to identify kinship placement options for children rather than reading through notes manually, because the model has a lower recall of names of Black people than white people, it's possible that this could result in more Black children being unnecessarily placed in non-kinship homes. The next set of information extraction models that we look at is co-reference resolution. And the task of co-reference resolution involves both identifying mentions in a text and linking them together if they refer to the same thing. We focus specifically on person, problem, treatment, and test entities. And this is a schema that we adapt from co-reference resolution models developed over medical notes. Example use cases of this kind of technology include tracking treatment or problem progress of a family or an individual over time, as well as identifying cases that might need supervisory review. When we look at the performance of an off-the-shelf co-reference resolution model, so one that's trained on out-of-domain data, we see that the model has a higher recall of problem entities for Black families than for white families. When we fine-tune the model on data that's annotated in our domain, we'd still see a higher recall of problem entities for Black families, and we also see a higher recall of treatment entities for white families. So this suggests that if we deployed this model, this could potentially result in unfairly increasing the scrutiny of Black families by focusing on problems over treatment. Overall, our work is an examination of risks of racial bias in a realistic deployed settings. And we do find significant evidence of racial bias in NER models. We find possible evidence of bias in co-reference resolution models, and we don't find evidence of increased bias in risk assessment models. While there is already a lot of critique of risk assessment tools in general, what our work shows is that deployment of information extraction tools without bias mitigation could also result in direct harms. While we focus primarily on racial bias in this paper, we also provide some discussion of additional risks of using NLP in this domain in general, including ways that it could reduce privacy, reduce transparency, or reinforce power imbalance by providing more tools to caseworkers and not necessarily directly to families. We're thankful to all of the people and agencies that have provided feedback or funding for this work. and we encourage you to check out our paper for more details. Thank you.